Good afternoon. Welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and welcome to those of you watching on the National Archives YouTube channel. I'm Tom Nastic of the Public Program staff, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's lecture, The Eddie Cantor Story, A Jewish Life in Performance and Politics, with our special guest, David Weinstein. Today's program is presented in celebration of Jewish American Heritage Month. But before we get to today's program, I want to tell you about two upcoming programs that will take place in this theater and on our YouTube channel. Tomorrow, May 3rd at noon, author Colin G. Calloway will be here to discuss and sign his new book, The Indian World of George Washington, the First President, the First Americans, and the Birth of a Nation. Calloway focuses on the importance of Indian power and Washington's belief that the country's fate depended upon expansion into the lands held by Native Americans. And then on Tuesday, May 8th at 7 p.m., we will present an evening with former White House photographer Pete Souza. Souza, who was President Barack Obama's chief official White House photographer and director of the White House Photo Office, will present an illustrated lecture using images from his recent book, Obama, An Intimate Portrait. Signed copies of the book will be available for purchase. To learn more about all of our public programs and exhibits, you can consult our monthly calendar of events online at archives.gov, or check out our website and sign up to get email updates. You'll also find information about other National Archives programs and activities. Another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports the work of the agency, especially its education and outreach programs. You can find out how at archivesfoundation.org. Our speaker today, David Weinstein, is making a return visit to the National Archives. He was here back in 2009 to lead a discussion related to his previous book, The Forgotten Network, Dumont and the Birth of American Television. David is a historian who lives and works in the Washington, D.C. area. He holds a PhD in American Studies and has taught at the University of Maryland and George Mason University. After today's lecture, he'll be signing copies of the Eddie Cantor story upstairs outside the Archives store. Please welcome David Weinstein back to the National Archives.
Hi. Thank you all for being here today. Thanks for that really nice introduction, Tom. It's really good to be part of the Archive celebration of Jewish Heritage Month. I think that if Eddie Cantor were here, he'd also get a kick out of the venue. I think he'd be really honored also, and like to be the subject of a book talk here. And he'd also be glad that all of you came out today. So I thank you on his behalf and, of course, on mine. Today I'll tell you a little bit about Eddie Cantor, who he was, his influence on American Jewish popular entertainment and politics. Eddie Cantor impacted the culture of his times, but he also influenced countless later entertainers. In addition to being a creative performer, Cantor was also very active politically. He used his position as an entertainer to talk about the social and political issues and problems of the day. So as I talk about him, you might find yourself connecting Cantor to more recent singers, actors, and comedians. This book was a labor of love. I wrote it over more than about 10 years. I work full-time at the National Endowment for the Humanities right down 7th Street. Though when I mention the NEH, I always add that this was a personal project, and my views here are not those of the NEH or the federal government. I would wake up around 4:30 in the morning most mornings, write for a couple hours till 6:30 or 7, get myself out the door, read what I wrote on the Metro a little bit and revise a little, and then do the same thing the next day. I also have a very kind and tolerant wife and kids who were willing to let me choose vacation spots around the country based on their proximity to Eddie Cantor archives. So I was able to travel everywhere from UCLA, several archives in New York. Didn't really have to travel for eBay, that's a little bit too easy. But anyway, I also did a lot of research locally, University of Maryland, Library of American Broadcasting, Library of Congress, and here at the National Archives, where the FCC records were really terrific and were especially useful to me. So I did a tremendous amount of research, and that research really, and primary materials really became the foundation for this book. Sometimes people ask me why Eddie Cantor. Eddie Cantor died a few years before I was born, so of course I never got to see him perform live or on television or anything. Short answer is that I like comedy. growing up, my father shared a lot of his favorite comedians with me. People like W.C. Fields, the Marx Brothers, Henny Youngman, Jackie Gleason, people that were popular in his youth during the 1950s. And over time, my interests expanded beyond comedy to everything from punk rock to independent film of the 1970s. But as I would listen to music, as I would watch these films, I became interested in connections, references, allusions, ways that the past and pop culture influenced the present. And this informed my continued research as I received my PhD and began to write and publish books and articles. My first book was called The Forgotten Network, Dumont and the Birth of American Television, and that looked at the history of television and the Dumont Television Network, which was America's first TV network. And in doing that research, I watched a ton of videotapes, not just on Dumont, but on the other three networks. And when I say the other three networks, there were four major networks at that time. One of those networks was NBC, and one of the most popular programs in the early 1950s, and one of the most influential programs was called the Colgate Comedy Hour. There were half a dozen or so, maybe a few more videotapes or streams now. You can find it on YouTube, bits and pieces of it, but it was a live program. It introduced Martin and Lewis to America. Cantor was one of the hosts. They had a rotating series of hosts. It was a comedy variety show. It was very popular, and I was a little bit surprised to see Eddie Cantor as one of the hosts of the Colgate Comedy Hour. Again, there were about a half a dozen Cantor episodes floating around. And he was really funny and fresh. Some other people from Vaudeville and the early 19-teens came back on television, and Cantor certainly belonged in that camp. But he was a lot fresher, funnier, and more charismatic than the others who made comebacks on TV. And as I did research, I found that it wasn't even a comeback for Cantor because he was continuously popular from the late 19-teens through the early 1950s. So I decided that I wanted to know more about him. And as you're doing research on one project, you sort of file it away in the maybe check it out later drawer. So that's what I did as I saw Cantor, liked him, decided I wanted to know more about him. My next article was an article on radio for this anthology, NBC America's Network. And this was an article, not a book, but it looked at how radio responded to Nazism and eventually the Holocaust from the 30s into the 1940s. And what I found in researching this was that Cantor popped up again as the radio star who was most prominent in opposing Nazism during the 1930s, often at great risk to his career. And that was interesting to me. So it also told me that he had a strong Jewish identity, and he's popping up in different projects. So he went in the research drawer again. And as I was looking for a new project, I decided that I wanted to learn more about him. Cantor was especially popular among Jewish audiences. This is a picture of an original record that was actually part of my grandparents' record collection that was passed down to me. And it doesn't surprise me that there was an Eddie Cantor record in their collection. They were Jewish, came of age in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And among that generation of especially American Jews, Cantor really did have a special place. He was popular with everybody, but he really resonated with Jewish audiences. So this project gave me an opportunity to research aspects of not just cultural history, but American Jewish history. And I decided to go forward with it. I broke this presentation into 4 sections. We'll leave time for questions at the end. I want to give you a brief overview of Cantor's life and career. Then I'm going to discuss his performances of the 1920s, his politics of the 1930s, and then we'll leave time for questions and discussion. Eddie Cantor was born in 1892, January 31st, 1892. His given name was Isidore Iskowitz. And with that name, you might not be surprised to learn that he was the child of Russian immigrants who had recently come over. He grew up in a series of Lower East Side tenements in New York, of course, and he was an orphan. That's his mother's death certificate. She died when he was 2. That's a photo of his father. He either died or left the family shortly thereafter. So he grew up an orphan on the city streets of New York. That's his grandmother, Esther Kantrowitz, and a picture of Eddie Cantor at around the age of 7. Esther Cantor was raised Eddie. That's his maternal grandmother. She later changed the name from Kantrowitz to the slightly less Jewish-sounding Cantor, but that's how he got his name when Esther changed it during his childhood. He was raised Jewish in a Yiddish-speaking household. He was not religiously observant, but he was fond of Jewish foods, Yiddish, even Jewish humor throughout his whole life. And these are all aspects of Jewish culture that he would have picked up on the Lower East Side growing up. He felt a strong Jewish cultural identity from childhood. And growing up in almost a predominantly Jewish part of the Lower East Side, among other Jews, he also felt a connection to other Jews that he took with him throughout his whole life. He also grew up very poor, and he had a great deal of empathy, both in his philanthropy and his politics, for people who were struggling economically. Eddie married a Lower East Side girl named Ida Tobias in 1914. That's a picture of Eddie and Ida. They remained married until her death in 1962, and they had 5 children, all girls. That's a picture of Cantor at around age 17 with his first show business suit. He went into show business in 1908. He was 16 years old, and it made sense for him. He had dropped out of school at age 12 after he slugged a teacher and got kicked out of school. And he was sort of knocking around the streets of the Lower East Side. He would take these short-term jobs, not really going anywhere, not really sure what he wanted to do. So he decided to go into show business, and it made sense economically. And this is the reason why a lot of especially working-class Jewish youths and working-class Irish youths from the cities went into show business. There were tons of theaters. You didn't have to be a brilliant talent to break into show business. And the sky was the limit. If you were good and if you were lucky, there was no limit to how much money you could make in show business. So it was attractive to a lot of people. Initially, he did impressions, but they were impressions of impressions because he was too poor to even get into the theaters to see the actors who he was impersonating. So he would sort of pick it up and do these little impressions. He would sing a little bit. He would pick up what he could on the streets in New York, get on stage at amateur hours and at small-time vaudeville theaters. Most of you look like you're too young to actually remember vaudeville. Vaudeville was, of course, a form of entertainment. There were vaudeville theaters that hosted this form of entertainment in cities and small towns across the country. A typical vaudeville bill would have 8 or 9 acts, singers, dancers, literally dog and pony shows, and performers would hook on with them. There were different rungs and different levels of vaudeville. Some paid a lot better and were a lot nicer than others. And Cantor gradually worked his way through vaudeville. He was never a huge star in vaudeville, and sometimes people refer to him as an old vaudevillian, and it's true that he was in vaudeville, but he was not a massive headliner, but he hooked on with the top circuit, and he was making a respectable living in vaudeville. When, in 1916, he hooked on with Florence Ziegfeld. Florence Ziegfeld was the major theatrical producer in America. We're talking 1916, before television, before radio, before sound film, when theatrical performers and theater was really very important in American culture. Along with silent film, the predominant form of popular entertainment during this time, enormously popular, and the biggest stars in America were mostly theater stars. Ziegfeld had the biggest shows, the glitziest shows, the most expensive shows. They would start off in New York with the Ziegfeld Follies or a companion show, the Ziegfeld Frolic, and then they would tour the country. So Ziegfeld's stars were really among the biggest national stars in the country. Cantor's co-stars during this time when he hooked on with Ziegfeld and the Ziegfeld Follies show included Burt Williams, Will Rogers, W.C. Fields, Fanny Brice, people who are slightly less known today like Marilyn Miller, but really among the biggest names in entertainment from this time. Cantor, at this point, was telling jokes. He had shed the old impersonations. He would sing a little, dance a little, tell some jokes. From 1916 to 1955, Eddie Cantor starred in every popular medium and every popular format. He was big on Broadway. From 1916 to 1930 alone, he headlined 10 different shows. He sang, he danced, he acted in musicals, he acted in revues, and many of these shows toured the country after playing in Broadway. Those are records. He had a number of hit records. Makin' Whoopi, You'd Be Surprised. I'm not going to sing, I promise. If You Knew Susie, How You Gonna Keep Them Down on the Farm After They've Seen Perry, Ida Sweet as Apple Cider. He was huge on sheet music. His image would appear on sheet music for the songs he would perform. This was during a time when a piece of sheet music could easily sell 500,000 copies, and people would play music in their homes and in their parlors. He was big on silent film during the 1920s. He was big on sound film, including musicals during the early 1930s when he was one of the biggest names in Hollywood. He had a number of best-selling books, starting with an autobiography published fairly early in his career in his life, 1928, My Life is in Your Hands, a number of joke books during the Great Depression that were enormously popular and influential. He had an extremely popular radio show, set all kinds of ratings records in the early 1930s, and he was on radio as a star from 1931 to 1949. And he was on television from 1950 to 1956, including shows like the Colgate Comedy Hour. And that's Maxie the Taxi from the Colgate Comedy Hour, a popular character that he created. This is an image of Cantor with not all of the awards, some of the awards that he won over the years. He was also a tireless philanthropist, tirelessly working for different charities. Some, such as the Red Cross, the American Legion. He was instrumental in a campaign to gather presents for the troops, Give a Gift to the Yank Who Gave. The March of Dimes, he was very influential early in the March of Dimes, and he came up with the idea of, rather than soliciting big donors, having people send dimes, literally to the White House, to President Roosevelt, because Roosevelt was very involved in the March of Dimes to fight infantile paralysis. And Cantor came up with the idea of using radio and radio stars to solicit small donations, and that was very successful. He was also very involved in Jewish charities and Jewish philanthropies, Hadassah, United Jewish Appeal, Israel Bonds, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the key takeaways at this point was Cantor was a superstar. He succeeded over multiple media over a long period of time. He was one of the most popular and best-known figures in America. From around 1920 to 1950, everybody knew who Eddie Cantor was. It wasn't enough for me in the book to recognize Cantor's fame. In the book, I used his fame as a starting point to talk more about what he did with his fame, and I found that Jewish themes were very important in helping me address these issues. The full title of the book is The Eddie Cantor Story of Jewish Life in Performance and Politics, and it traces the way Cantor expresses Jewishness in these two areas. For the remainder of my talk, I want to highlight two different periods of Cantor's life that illustrate these broader themes. I want to look at his performances of the 1920s and his anti-Nazi politics of the 1930s. So starting with his performances of the 1920s, Cantor created and popularized Jewish characters and Jewish performance styles that have become staples of American Jewish comedy. And I don't have time to go over all of them here, but one that I want to focus on is the Jewish wise guy and Cantor's importance in developing that particular type. And I also argued that Cantor, in doing this, represented a new style of Jewish performance. When Cantor began his career in the late 19-teens, Jews had limited options for expression. Many actors hid their Jewishness, changed their names, took on what we can call secular roles, and just sort of went about their careers without any reference to any Jewish background or even the fact that they were Jewish. At the other end, a lot of Jewish actors played very stereotypical characters, and these are a couple of images from sheet music and a CD cover that compiles a lot of that. Big hats, fake noses, stereotypes of Jews being cheap and greedy, and there are also a lot of images of what we call the Jewish greenhorn, the recent immigrant with the funny accent who does ridiculous things because he or she doesn't really understand America. So that was the landscape for Jewish performance circa 1915 when Cantor breaks onto Broadway. Cantor was different. He was comfortable, he was casual, he was modern in his characterizations. He played the kind of people that you might run into on a city street. They were Jewish, but the Jewishness didn't define them. They were one part of who they were. The distinction is you're laughing with them, you're not laughing at them. And to give you an example of this one stock character that Cantor played, there's the Jewish wise guy. Cantor developed this character. He introduced it in a sketch called Joe's Blue Front, which he debuted in a play called The Midnight Rounders in 1920. And he played variations of this character through the mid-1930s. Cantor liked to insert Jewish, what we can call codes into his performances. Yiddish phrases, references to kosher food, references to places in the Lower East Side that had special meaning to Jews. It was his way of confirming from the stage that he was Jewish for people who recognized these codes. A sort of wink to audience members without being too Jewish or without being too stereotypical. And over time, Jewish and non-Jewish audiences grew to recognize and appreciate these kinds of references. So listen for those in the clip that I'm about to play. Cantor's playing a tailor who you'll see in a minute. It's a tailor/salesman. He's a tailor who's also trying to sell a suit. In this sketch, Joe's Blue Front. And as you watch this, watch for subtle Jewish cultural codes and references. You'll hear Yiddish phrasing and a slight accent. Cantor's going to say, "Eat at Yan Sarah's, I don't care where you eat." So listen for that kind of thing. Even the job, he's a tailor in a cut-rate clothing shop, would have signaled Jewish to people in the audience. There were some ads in which, from clothing manufacturers as Cantor toured the country, many of these ads placed the shop on Baxter Street, which was known as a Jewish neighborhood for these sort of cheap clothing shops. So listen for that, for the job. And notice the influence of this type of character, the fast-talking, resourceful, edgy, wise guy. So maybe think of somebody like a Mel Brooks, a Don Rickles, even a Larry David as you watch this clip. In the year 2012, Martin Scorsese called this particular scene the essence of Jewish comedy. The entire sketch is around 11 minutes. I'd like to play a 1-minute clip just to give you a sense, a flavor of that scene and what Cantor does here. So Cantor's going to come on in a second with the tape measure around his neck, and the man in the middle, as you'll see, is the customer.
Here we are in the clothing department.
Say, you got quite a building here.
I should say so.
I want to tell you something, my dear man. That's the best suit of clothes we got in the whole
What's the
house.
matter with you? What's the matter with you?
What's the matter?
It's a man's own suit.
Go ahead, kill me. Go ahead.
Take off your hat and coat, my friend. Make it look perfectly at home. That's the idea. Let me see. You're taking about 46 stars. Now, I've got for you here something very beautiful. Here is a lovely golf suit. A very handsome English walking suit, the latest cut. Comes right straight from the Piccadilly. That's lovely.
Look at those shoulders.
Beautiful.
How that fits.
Wonderful.
Take a walk around. See how you feel in the suit. Just move around. Easy.
There's a nail sticking me in the back.
That's not a nail. That's our own invention. You know how you go into a restaurant, you hang up your umbrella and your hat, and you get indigestion, you think somebody's going to steal it? This is our own invention. When you take this, you can take your umbrella and your hat and you hang it up, and nobody can steal it from you. Take a walk. Take a walk. How does it feel now?
It's all right, but I don't eat in the restaurant.
Look, eat in your Aunt Sarah's house, eat in cafe. I don't care where you eat, but you'll take the suit. I'll tell you what to do. Are you a sport? Do you play casino? You take the suit, and we'll send you home in a taxi cab, all right? Call him a taxi cab, all right?
I want a belt in the back.
All right, I'll fix you.
You're going to get a belt.
Here is something.
The next clip that I have is from the film Whoopi. The film is from 1930, and it's based on the popular Broadway play of 1928-29. The song is Makin' Whoopi, and it's by Walter Donaldson and Gus Kahn, written for Cantor for this play and for this movie. It's a nice example of Cantor's singing. You get a sense of his confidence as a performer, and you get a sense of the range of his talents. His humorous delivery, watch the eye rolls, watch the way he dances, the way he sings, does a little bit of everything. You'll also notice that it's in color. Whoopi was filmed in Technicolor in 1930. It's an early example of color film, Technicolor film. And Cantor was also relatively young at the time. He was 38. So it adds to its value of a snapshot of what Cantor was like on stage and film during the late 20s and early 1930s. Most of you know Makin' Whoopi? It's It's become an American standard, widely performed. And now you hear that song, it's sort of sweet, nostalgic, romantic, even a little bit sexy, especially if you throw Michelle Pfeiffer on a piano while you perform it, right? Or light jazz instrumentals. I'm referring to the Fabulous Baker Boys, if some of you have seen that. But initially it was more subversive. It was part of a play that parodies conventional notions of love, of marriage, of masculinity. And if you listen carefully to the lyrics, it's sort of an off-kilter love song, from wedding to boring domesticity, infidelity, pending divorce, alimony. So this was typical for Cantor. He liked to be a little bit sneaky, subtle, slightly subversive in his social commentary. So I'm going to play that clip now.
Morgan.
Wait a minute, girls. You've got plenty of time. Really. Every time I hear that dear old wedding march, I feel rather glad I have a broken arch. I have heard a lot of married people talk, and I know that marriage is a long, long walk. To most people, weddings mean romance, but I prefer a picnic or a dance. Another bride, another groom, the countryside is all in bloom. The flowers and trees, the birds and bees are making whoopee. The choir sings, here comes the bride. Another victim is by her side. He's lost his reason, 'cause it's the season for making whoopee. Down through the countless ages, you'll find it everywhere. Somebody makes good wages. Somebody wants her share. She calls him Toodles and rolls her eyes. She makes him strudels and bakes him pies. What is it all for? It's so he'll fall for making whoopee. Another year, or maybe less. What's this I hear? Well, can't you guess? She feels neglected, and he's suspected of making whoopee. She sits alone most every night. He doesn't phone or even write. He says he's busy, but she says, is he? He's making whoopee. He doesn't make much money, $5,000 per. Some judge who thinks he's funny says you pay $6 to her. He says, now judge, suppose I fail. The judge says, Bud, right into jail. You'd better keep her. You'll find it's cheaper than making whoopee.
Yeah. I want to transition now to talk a little bit about Blackface. Eddie Cantor performed in Blackface. It was a theatrical convention that originated in the 19th century. White and even some black performers would put on black makeup and perform as black characters, frequently ridiculing African Americans. It's racist, offensive, and even grotesque to us today. It's hard to watch, but it is part of history. It's part of American history, and it's part of Eddie Cantor's history. As a historian researching Cantor, rather than ignoring blackface, I found it important to contextualize it, to understand what it meant to Cantor and what it meant to his audiences. And I found that the meaning of blackface changed a great deal even over the course of Cantor's career from the 19-teens through the early 1950s. And I chronicle this change in the book. Cantor began using blackface very early in his career, around 1909, as blackface was enjoying a revival in Vaudeville. And he was enormously popular with the Ziegfeld Follies during the late 19-teens using blackface. He gradually used the makeup less starting in 1918. Many other emerging comedians, especially Jewish comedians and Irish comedians, also used it as a novelty during the 19-teens. Sophie Tucker, George Burns, George Jessel, and most famously Al Jolson all performed in blackface. It was a way to signal that they were singers or comedians for the audience as opposed to other kinds of performers. When Cantor wore blackface, he usually performed as himself, a Jewish comedian, and that was part of the joke. Especially earlier in his career, people would see the blackface and they would expect references to the Old South or aspects of black culture, which somebody like Jolson did frequently, and that was more typical for blackface performers. So Cantor would wear blackface and he would give them a Jewish wise guy. And you get an example of this. I'm going to play a 1929 clip of Cantor performing in blackface. This is the earliest recorded blackface clip of Cantor, and it's a sound clip. But this time he was using blackface almost nostalgically. He wasn't using it for an entire show. When he put on blackface, it was his way of saying to the audience, I'm going to give you the kind of jokes and songs that I did 10 or 15 years earlier with the Ziegfeld Follies. So he's wearing blackface, but he's playing himself a Jewish performer. He's not playing an African-American character. If you were only listening to this performance and not seeing it, you wouldn't even know that he was in blackface. Blackface is so overwhelming and so central to us now when we watch a clip like this, but it would have been only one element of the performance and not an especially important one for a 1929 audience. So consider a few aspects of the performance in addition to the blackface. Note the Henry Ford joke. Henry Ford was well known for his anti-Semitism and from promoting anti-Semitism through the 1920s. Also, of course, founder of Ford Motors. And Cantor makes a joke about Ford. In 1927, under a lot of pressure, Henry Ford apologized to the Jewish people. So Cantor jokes about this. And one of the common accusations by Ford and his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, was about Jewish businessmen, Jewish acumen, Jewish control. And Cantor sort of tweaks that by making a joke about Jewish sales skills with cars that you'll hear in a minute. More broadly, though, you get a sense of Cantor's charisma, his verbal wit, his risque style, his comfort with his Jewishness, and also his command of the stage in this clip, in addition to how he used the blackface. So let me just... There it goes.
All right. I respond. I give in. You know, we had Automobile Week here a short while ago, and of course we had a lot of automobile men came up here on the roof, some of them with their wives, and one fellow came to me and said he represented the Lincoln Agency, and he said, Cantor, if you can only use the name of Lincoln or Ford in your monologue someplace, why, we'd be glad to give you a little Ford coupe. And of course, so I got the Ford coupe, and I want to tell you they're cute. Oh, the darling little coffee clots you ever saw. For instance, no, listen, on the new Fords, they've got wire wheels and four-wheel brakes. Everything is nickel-plated. And here's a great feature. They have a non-shatterable windshield. In case of an accident, the glass doesn't scatter. It hits you one piece like this. Oh, and myself, personally, I'm tickled to death that Henry Ford apologized to a race of people with whom I'm very familiar. And I know why Mr. Ford was angry at the Jewish people in the first place. Leave it to Cantor to find out, you know. They were getting more money for second-hand Fords than he was getting for new ones. That's what you know, I know, ladies and gentlemen, you'll be very glad to hear that Mr. Ziegfeld has made me a partner in the Midnight Frolic, beginning tonight. I know you'll be happy to hear about it. He's very appreciated. I played in a lot of follies for him and Kid Boots and now in Whoopi. And in fact, he's insisting that I become a partner in the play. I received a note from him tonight. Here's what he says in the note. He said, Dear Eddie, unless you take an interest in the Midnight Frolic, we'll have to get another comedian. I don't know what it was. Great fellow, Ziegfeld. I don't care for diamond rings, real estate and other things. What's $1 million more or less? I don't care to own a yacht. Fame can't mean an awful lot. My ambition you would never get.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about Cantor's Politics. We're going to move forward to the mid-1930s and focus on Cantor's importance and his courage in speaking out against anti-Semitism and Nazism. And again, you might want to think about the countless performers today who use platforms from Twitter to late-night television to comment on politics. Cantor was an important forerunner of these figures. For Jews in the 1930s, anti-Semitism was a very real threat. Public opinion polls showed that many Americans had low opinions of Jews and opposed changes in immigration laws that would have admitted more Jewish refugees from Europe. That a couple of images, or an image in an article from Nazi rallies. There were Nazi rallies throughout the 1930s, Nazi supporters in government, in law enforcement. And at the heart of anti-Semitic rhetoric was the idea that Jews had too much power, that they were not, quote, good Americans, and that they put Jewish interests over American interests and would ultimately lead the country to a catastrophic war with Germany. Jews in public life had to be especially careful because if they pushed for things like relaxation of immigration laws or spoke against anti-Semitism too strongly, they would leave themselves open to anti-Semitic charges that they were disloyal to America. So this is the backdrop in which Cantor and most public Jews were operating. Despite the risks, Cantor decided to become very active with a group called Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization of America, and in particular with a campaign that Hadassah was running at the time for a group called Youth Aliyah. Youth Aliyah was a German group that was promoting immigration to Palestine, pre-Israel Palestine, and Hadassah was interested in building up Palestine, so that was their interest as a Zionist organization doing a lot of social service work there. Cantor became involved with Hadassah, and he goes town to town. This is a relatively small Jewish Zionist group. He goes town to Hadassah meetings all across the country to raise money. He doesn't perform. He doesn't sing and dance. Instead, he makes speeches. He talks about politics. And again, this is one of America's biggest stars. He also does public radio, public service announcements on radio for Hadassah. He writes articles for the Jewish press, and many of his speeches are picked up by the major mainstream media. So he's addressing Jewish and non-Jewish audiences. And he's not strictly promoting a Zionist message. He's not talking a lot about Palestine. He's talking about America. He says anti-Semitism is a very real threat in America. What's happening in Europe could happen in the United States. American Jews have a moral obligation to try to save European refugees and support their European co-religionists. And he's also saying that Jews are good Americans, and that speaking out against bigotry, speaking out against prejudice is an expression of patriotism, and that those who question the Americanism of Jews or support Nazi Germany are the true threats to the American way of life. These are courageous statements for a figure like Cantor to be making at this time. They're risky to his career during a time when radio sponsors control content and networks, and they're even risky to his life. Cantor was subject to numerous death threats. There's an article on one in the paper because of his politics from people on the right, including Nazis in America. Cantor was different from others on the Hollywood left who spoke against fascism but didn't talk about the particular Jewish dimensions as much. And I have the other picture of Cantor signing autographs because this was a very different time in the 1930s than it is today. Getting into the archives, you pass through a metal detector. Celebrities did not have the level of insulation and bodyguards and security and protection that they do now, which makes the threats were credible. They were real and they were dangerous. I want to talk about two incidents to sort of wind down my talk that illustrate Cantor's courage, the anti-Nazi politics of the time, and the struggle that's going on in America over what constitutes, quote, a good American. The first one is from 1938. In August 1938, Henry Ford, who we talked about a little bit earlier, received the highest decoration given by Germany to foreigners, and you see him receiving the medal. It was called the Grand Cross of the Supreme Order of the German Eagle. Ford is an American hero, comparable to a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs. I used to put Mark Zuckerberg there, but with the current politics, I'm not sure. But anyway, he was one of these iconic figures, captain of industry, widely respected. And he was also known for putting people to work during the Depression through his Ford company, through his car company. That's a picture of Cantor arriving in England. He had just come back from England at the time that Ford received the medal, where he was raising money for Hadassah and Youth Aliyah and seeing the conditions firsthand. Eddie Cantor called Henry Ford a damned fool, and he said that Ford was being used by German propagandists and propaganda that was being spread in the U.S. Cantor also said, quote, "I question Mr. Ford's Americanism and his Christianity. I don't think he, meaning Ford, is a real American or a good Christian. The more men like Ford we have, the more we must organize and fight." These comments, as you see from the New York Times article, received wide coverage. And it's partially because Cantor was a celebrity. When he talked about things, people listened, people cared. And they provoked a vicious backlash. In my research, I found a stack of hate mail that people wrote to Cantor. Several of them linked Cantor, Jews, and communists. Several defended Ford for putting Americans to work while Cantor's out in England raising funds for German refugees and Youth Aliyah. I found letters where people explicitly called for Cantor and other Jews to be wiped off the face of the earth. And I also found many letters with people threatening to boycott Cantor's radio program, including multiple signatures. These letters were dangerous for somebody who needed public approval to practice his trade. And it was courageous for Cantor to do what he did, and he kept speaking out. The next year, Cantor made a speech to Hadassah members at the 1939 World's Fair at that building. That's the Temple of Religion Pavilion. And he condemned the anti-Semitism of Father Charles Coughlin, who was a popular radio priest. That's an image of Coughlin there on my left, your right. He also condemned a senator from North Carolina, Robert Rice Reynolds. More than that, though, he said important industrialists are behind these anti-Semitic figures. And he warned that Nazism and fascism could come to America. This is 1939. And these were serious accusations that fascists were using American industry, American media, and American government to spread anti-Semitic messages. His speech received wide coverage. That's an article where he reprinted the speech in the Jewish press. And after that, his radio sponsor, Camel Cigarettes, decided to drop Cantor, even though Cantor was a very popular figure because of his politics. And even more than that, nobody else would pick up his program and sponsor him, which meant that Cantor was off the air. Cantor later said that that speech put his career in jeopardy and cost him $500,000, which is what he would have made for a season of radio, which of course was a tremendous amount of money back then. This seems like a good place to wind down my talk, with Eddie Cantor courageously speaking against anti-Semitism and paying a high price for his principled activism. So I hope you now think of Cantor a little bit differently as both a pioneering Jewish entertainer and a courageous Jewish political activist. There was much in the book and in Cantor's life that I didn't have time to cover during this presentation, but I'm glad to take your questions about any period of Cantor's life, and I really do appreciate your attentive interest. Thank you very much.
If you have a question, if you could go to either one of the microphones, please.
Let me first thank you for a very interesting talk. I have a few questions. The first question deals with his, like many in those times, certainly using blackface, right? Did he have any, given the fact that he was very poor and marginalized, basically a Russian Jewish immigrant, what was, in the first place, his relationship with the more established German Jews, who often looked down on these Russian Jews, et cetera, and were afraid that they, because of their still, adaptive situation, would put him in more deeper problems facing anti-Semitism. So that's the first thing. The second one would be, did he have any relationships with blacks, with minorities, and how and in what ways did this influence his position vis-a-vis blackface, right? Vis-a-vis the issue that minorities were facing in media and stuff like that, the massive, especially if you look at African Americans. I mean, the racism is even more catastrophic to a certain extent. to come on the other thing now is the issue of his politics, which I knew a little bit about, but not to this extent, to be honest with you, and I'm kind of shocked. Was he ever, because of the talks he was giving, was he ever, did he ever had anything to do with HUAC? Did he ever, was he ever, called in front to say, just a minute here, but you are leftist, a communist, et cetera, et cetera? And what, because you didn't get to that point, right? What was his relationship with the coming about, which was very important to Jewish Americans, right? The coming about of the state of Israel, right? How did he relate to that? Did he become somewhat more critical of it over time, or did he remain enamored with it, throughout the rest of it? Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I love these questions. Quick plug for the book. I deal with all of these issues in the book, and I thank you so much for them. They're great questions. There was a lot of tension between German and Russian Jews. The German Jews thought a lot, the Russian Jews, especially entertainers, were vulgar. There were social class issues. A lot of the Germans had established the previous generation. They were very involved in Jewish philanthropy. And Cantor countered that by becoming very involved in a lot of those charities himself. And because of that, it sort of elevated his position among the German Jews. He would be at fundraisers with people like Felix Warburg, who was one of the more prominent German Jews at the time. He would raise money for a lot of the federations and organizations. And that was important to him because he wanted a place in the American Jewish community, and he didn't want to seem like this sort of silly, vulgar comedian. So he worked very hard to sort of bridge those gaps. And he's one of the few figures in the American Jewish community at the time, which was very divided on many different levels, that everybody liked. Because with his stature, he was almost able to float above a lot of the conflicts. And he could raise a ton of money for your organization if you decided to show up or if you decided to have an event for him. So because of his position, he was able to bridge a lot of the differences, and that helped solidify his position in the Jewish community. Great question. The second question had to do with his relationship with minorities, especially African Americans. And what I found is that many of the articles in the black press especially talked about Cantor as a, quote, friend of the race, because he employed a lot of African American performers. And images and stereotypes were certainly important through the first half of the 20th century, but many of the articles in the black press were also concerned about employment and getting black actors jobs. So white performers like Cantor, who would have African Americans on their program, generally got a lot of credit from the African American press. And Cantor occasionally talked about his affinities with African Americans in terms of rights and connected Jewish struggles and African American struggles, but mainly through his employment practices by everybody from the Nicholas brothers in the 1930s to Sammy Davis Jr. in the early 1950s, not only employing these figures, but really supporting them on stage and off. He had a very good reputation among African American audiences and in the African American press. Now, things start to change in the early 1950s because of the blackface, and I write about this in the book. In 1952, that's really the last time on television that Cantor uses blackface, because with the civil rights movement, it's so overwhelming, and there rightfully is such public support and support among the networks to stop the practice and to limit it, that he stops performing in blackface. But again, given the times, he did not see a contradiction that is glaring to us today between performing in blackface and doing what he could to support African Americans, especially African American performers. I write about HUAC in the book also, the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Blacklist. Cantor was very savvy in that he would cultivate friendships with people like J. Edgar Hoover. He did a lot of work with the American Legion. He did what he could to bridge gaps with conservative groups, with different religions, especially after 1939, where I talk about how he rehabilitated his image somewhat so that he could return to radio and so that he could resume his career And part of that was praising figures like Hoover. Part of that, and this is especially after the 1939 pact between Hitler and Stalin, coming out against both communism and fascism more strongly. So he retooled his image somewhat. At the same time, in 1950, from Carnegie Hall, Cantor says, "We're here today for a nice nostalgic evening so that we can forget about the H-bomb and Senator Joseph McCarthy and other evil things that can destroy mankind," which was very courageous for Cantor to say that in 1950. He also went on a tour with his one-man show, which was a nostalgic act, but he specifically supported actors, Gene Muir, for example, Irene Wicker, who were being blacklisted and who were forced off of television. And he did that for a while through 1950, from the stage, in an interview with the New York Times, in letters to NBC executives. At the end of 1950, it's clear that the blacklist is going to continue, and that if he continues to speak like that, it's just going to be too dangerous for his career. So he tones down that rhetoric, but for a while he tried to support and defend actors who were blacklisted on principled terms, saying that this is wrong. I talk a lot about his post-war politics also. The other question was about Israel. And I talk about his post-war politics and his support of Israel frequently in American terms, in terms of patriotism, in terms of connections between the United States and Israel, democracy, a fledgling home for immigrants, using those sort of tropes and talking about Israel and raising funds for Israel is sort of the very short answer, but really good questions. Thank you.
Hi, David. I read your book about the Dumont Network. It was
Thank
excellent.
you.
I can't wait to read this one.
Thank you.
I have three questions, although they're not as substantial as those fantastic questions were. First of all, how much involvement did he have with Yiddish theater? Also, what was his relationship to Al Jolson? And the third one is, it'll come to me as soon as you answer the first. Did you get a chance to talk to some of his descendants?
Thanks, good questions. Cantor did not do a lot with the Yiddish theater, and he didn't, even though he spoke Yiddish, he did not speak Yiddish frequently, except as for his entire act. He would sort of spice his act with Yiddish. There was a thriving Yiddish theater, and I think Cantor had bigger aspirations, frankly. I think that he saw himself ultimately being a star for all of America, and I think that that fueled a lot of what he did. So he did not do a lot directly with the Yiddish theater, even though he knew some of the people who were involved. Jolson, it's interesting. I think that they were show business friends. They would appear on each other's shows, radio shows especially. One of my favorite clips is Jolson appearing with Eddie Cantor at an anniversary show, circa 1941, and talking about the good old days growing up on the Lower East Side and Eddie's courtship of Ida. There's only one problem with that. Al Jolson grew up in Washington, D.C. and not New York. So there was a little bit of shtick that they were doing. They were joking around and playing very much with the history. And I think that there was a lot of that. Among this generation of performers, it's almost become parody, but they were always great friends on stage. And it's hard to tell off stage. There were certainly rivalries earlier in their career, and it plays to your other question about descendants. 50, 60, 70 years later, as a historian, it's hard to tell what really went on behind closed doors, and that was not my interest so much as really looking at the documentation, the public performances, the radio programs, and Cantor's made many memoirs and memoirs from people like George Jessel, Sophie Tucker, people who knew him and worked with him. I really tried to go with these primary sources, or as close to primary sources as I could, in writing this book and constructing this history.
And And my thanks also, David. This has been wonderful respite from work also, and a little valley. So there's this wonderful book called A Fine Romance by poet David Lehman about the contributions to the American songbook by Jewish writers, by Rodgers and Hammerstein and Irving Berlin. And so I don't know whether you're familiar with this book, but it's quite wonderful. And it talks about how these immigrants and sons of immigrants themselves can so beautifully capture the American experience, but having come from the outside, oh, what a beautiful morning. I mean, it's like quintessential, right? Yeah. So I was wondering both whether Eddie Cantor had any interactions with this group of composers and writers, and how you would see whether they're kind of like parallel stories or somewhat different, because of course they weren't reflecting a Jewish experience, they were reflecting a quintessential American experience, whereas Eddie Cantor was much more, I'm a guy from the Lower East Side, so.
That's a terrific question about the relationship, but also the way things worked a little bit differently. There was certainly a hierarchy in Hollywood and especially in Broadway theater. And as a star, people were constantly pitching Cantor, hoping that he would sing his songs, because Cantor could sell 500,000 copies of sheet music, which is really where the composers made their money. Cantor was friendly with Irving Berlin. Irving Berlin wrote the song You'd Be Surprised and coached Cantor on how to sing it, for example. So it becomes interesting. I think that there were cases where there were closer relationships, but I think that there were different issues that maybe kept them apart. Not only everybody being so busy, but on the one hand, it was clear that the songwriters were supposed to write music for the star with the star in mind. And not only songwriters, but there are also tensions in radio between the writers and the stars. And this is sometimes even parodied in TV shows and movies from the time, where the writer thinks that they're the brains, and many of the songwriters were educated, came from more of a middle class versus Cantor's working class. So there were weird class tensions that sometimes went on among the writers and the stars, with the writers feeling like they were the brains behind things and the stars feeling like they were the talent. And this really exploded a lot more in radio, and I write a little bit about this, where there were a lot of tensions. And the radio writers who have been interviewed talk about Cantor being bossy and not having talent. So it becomes, it's hard to tell exactly what those sort of personal dynamics were, but I think that they did share an important aesthetic as Jewish outsiders who really wanted to entertain Americans and sort of balance that Jewish or American identity. So Cantor sang songs as very frequently from all of the major composers from that time, and he would be just as happy singing a Christmas song on his radio program as anything else. He did not sing a lot of Jewish songs, although I mentioned a case in 1931 on a Yom Kippur broadcast where he sang, or there was an instrumental version, he didn't actually sing it, of the Kol Nidre. So he would occasionally introduce those types of Jewish elements, of course, the Yom Kippur prayer, onto his program. But I think that like the songwriters who you mentioned, they're constantly balancing the need to entertain America as a whole and really expressing their love and interest in America with reconciling their Jewish background as outsiders, as you mentioned, and trying to balance those different sort of cultural impulses within a broader industry with all of these hierarchies. So it's a great question. I feel like there are lots of dynamics going on with it. One more, yeah.
Hey, David. Really interesting stuff, and sounds like you brought out a lot of new things, or at least, new things in the last 70 or 80 years anyway. And especially the political things I thought were really interesting. I mean, these issues he was talking about the faith and the anti-Nazism in the late 30s. And I know from my new book how involved he was with labor in 1933 as the actors and directors guilds were coming up, and he was even lobbying FDR in some ways. So yeah, he's an amazing figure artistically, politically, all kinds of ways. The question I was going to ask, though, is that I'm always interested in these figures like your friend Mr. Cantor here, who succeed in all these technologies for decades, and their talent keeps on being recognized. And like you say, like he doesn't even seem to have a comeback. He just kind of goes smoothly through it, and people love him throughout that period from vaudeville to TV. And that does seem a meaningful thing. You know, you look at a lot of really important American artists, like, I don't know, like Miles Davis or Duke Ellington, or even like Madonna or Bob Dylan. These people morph over time. And so I'm just curious, what do you think were the qualities that allowed Cantor to do that for so many decades?
That's a terrific question. How did Cantor move through these different media and adapt his personality and his performance to the different media? And I think it's a great question. I think Cantor always had his pulse on the people. And it could be, people have theorized, and I think there's something to this, though I don't totally buy it, that a lot of Jewish performers, as both outsiders but also people who had a foot in this sort of broader culture, are able to sort of read audiences very well. But Cantor was fantastic at that, not only in adapting to different media, but during the Depression, he's the first one with the jokes, and he releases a record in 1929 with jokes about the stock market while everybody is in shock over it. And this continues into the 1930s. He knows when to pull out the nostalgia. So he's very good at the content, and I think that that's really the key. And then he's able to sort of, once he gets a sense of what he wants to communicate and what people want to hear, and the sort of general tenor of the times, he's then able to adapt it to the different media. He's also very good at choosing talent, hiring people, having them migrate with him. He very much sees it as a team effort, but he pays his writers. Whereas not everybody does on radio. In some cases, it's the network or the sponsor who's paying the writers. He has a great deal of control. He knows his image. He knows in general what he wants to say, and he gets very good people in the different media to help him adapt. But it's still very unusual, and I think it's because he has these multi-talents, plus he's able to read the audiences so well, and he really does have his finger on the pulse of the nation for so long, and that's part of why, when I write about in the book, his evolution, it's really the evolution of America and American culture over these years. Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Once again, David will be signing copies of his book. When will